The first Omen is directed by Arkasha Stevenson. It stars Nell Tiger Free, Ralph Ineson, among others. And this is a prequel to the events of the original Omen film from 1976, directed by Richard Donner. And in this story, it deals with an American woman that goes to a church in Rome. And very similar to another film that came out earlier this year called Immaculate, she discovers that there's some weird things happening around this church. And it mainly has to do with the birth of the Antichrist that's going around with the film. And it pretty much all sets it up for the original movie that came out in 1976. And I'll leave it there because there's some other stuff that it goes beyond what's the general premise of it. Now here's a little backstory. Now, going into this film, I'll admit that I'm a little kind of behind as far as the Omen series. I've seen the original finally a few years ago, or within the last couple of years, I finally got a chance to watch the original Omen film from 1976. And I got to admit that it took me a very long time to fully watch its entirety, but I do really enjoy the original film, and I think it still holds as a very, one of the greats from the 1970s, especially with, those kind of religious type of horror films we got, especially with the original Exorcist and everything. And it may not be on par as far as great as severely great on the Exorcist, but I still think it's a really great and suspenseful horror film in its own right. And I, to this day, have still never seen the rest of them. I haven't seen any of the sequels, and even to this day, I've never even seen the remake. So I'm pretty far behind as far as the actual Omen series. And so going into this one, just going based off my knowledge of the first film, I was actually really skeptical. I really felt like, when I heard within the last year or so, when word got around that they were planning to do a supposed prequel to the first film, I just got really skeptical because I was thinking to myself okay, from what I remember watching from the first movie, the movie kind of really told its story that it really didn't need necessarily a prequel to kind of really set it up. And so going into it, I was having the same expectations like I had with the Thing prequel that came out in 2011, where it's like, what's really the point of doing this if it doesn't really have, if you kind of really predict a lot of what's going to happen in setting everything up and stuff. And very rarely do we ever get any kind of prequels that do kind of work in their own regard. There are some examples that do work, in my opinion, like, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and to some extent, I will give credit to at least Prometheus on trying to do its own thing. And also, I have a soft spot for Wonka, because I thought Wonka was a good prequel of its own right to the original Gene Wilder version. And given for all its flaws, I will say that there are some good aspects that I do find myself at least with the overall prequel trilogy, of the Star Wars prequel trilogy. Well, mainly Revenge of the Sith, but but I digress. So going into this, I just kind of really had no really expectations for it, because I felt like this was going to be one of those unnecessary prequels that comes and goes, and it's really forgotten about, just like the remake we had from 2006, which to this day, like I said, I never fully watched. But from what I also heard, that's what you don't do when it comes to a remake. And even seeing some of the scenes in the trailer with this one, where you're seeing familiar scenes that call back to the original and stuff, I felt myself really watching okay, are they just going to be rehashing stuff that we already know is going to happen in the first movie? And then, and also, how is this really going to work, especially when we know what's going to happen? And so, after much of delaying and everything since the movie has come out, because I kind of got the late start watching it, I will have to admit that this was actually quite a surprise. I can't admit to say it, but I actually really enjoyed this film. It has its issues that I'll get into later, but it does work in its own regard, and I actually really felt myself enjoying a film that can actually tie really good to the first film in its own right. Much like similar to what I had with Wonka, this is another prequel that does its service by trying to honor the original film, but also trying to do its own spin and explore a lot of stuff that we didn't really get to see much of in the original film itself. That they kind of add some things with. And so to get my pros out of the way, I thought the cast in this was really great. Nell Tiger Free, I thought, was really great in this as the lead. She really carries her own. She is very similar to what I would describe as Sydney Sweeney's performance in Immaculate, in that she holds her own with dealing with all being scared and stuff, and going into this whole investigation that she's going with and everything. And much like that film, it plays into that as well. And so this could also be more of a double feature with that movie. But there's aspects in this one that I do find myself more into and more invested with compared to Immaculate, because I think this one, to me, had a more stronger script in certain aspects that I found myself more engaged with. But she was great. And then it's also great seeing Ralph Ineson. I've really grown to really like that guy as an actor, especially in seeing him in other stuff like The Witch and some other things. And the guy really pulls it off great as the priest that's, trying to look for trying to come up with the investigation and everything of what's happening that he believes is going to be causing the Antichrist in the church. And he was great. And then also, there are some familiar favorites in this I didn't really expect to see in this that I caught me off guard. And there's a couple of big actors in this that I won't spoil, but it was really nice seeing them on screen. I was like, wow, that's pretty cool seeing them. And then to get my other pros, the way the story engages with it going into this, isolated feel of her pretty much like going in the orphanage and trying to uncover some sketchy stuff. It, much like Immaculate, it puts you in that kind of like claustrophobic type of vibe where, for the most part, it is mostly set at this orphanage and stuff, but there are other scenes where it takes place outside of it that, you get to see expand some stuff on that comes into play, especially when, funny enough, we get into a disco scene that happens that it may seem like it kind of feels out of place. I mean, especially the way the tone goes and in the way the story plays out, but it has a good purpose the way it plays into. So I'll leave it there because there's some stuff in this film that I can't get into if I go into spoilers. But that's also the biggest thing I can really admit to is that the disturbing level that the movie takes as far as like getting you in that kind of very unsettling manner, especially when we get into some really crazy scenes like you see from the trailer that have to deal with giving birth and stuff like that. Much like Immaculate, this one also had me on that edge too. And while it may not be as certain stuff Immaculate was able to get away with, this one I think really put me on a more different type of vibe that very similar to that one. It just really made me feel really, it gives me chills down my spine the way it was playing along with it. And and also how it goes into tying some stuff into the original film I thought was not only great, but also the way they expand on some more stuff that we get into, the stuff involved that has to do with this church and everything. It really plays into a lot of the great build-up that I found myself very immersed, and it really caught me off guard, especially with some stuff that happens about later on in the film that I thought was a really great twist that happened. And so there's that. And then the score was also great. You hear some familiar beats that they try to use from the original film that I thought really worked in this regard, especially hearing the classic theme that was by Jerry Goldsmith in the original. That comes back in this, which is great. And then you also have some there are some really well-timed jump scares in this that I'll get into some of my cons with a little later on because they do kind of feel a little predictable at times, but there are some really good ones that got me, and I got to give it really credit with that because I'm glad to see that this film, tries to go into that very older, not really say old school, but like that very, classic type of filmmaking style that I do really miss with horror films. It's very rare that we get these kind of films, and the last time I can remember them doing something like this was earlier when we had Late Night with the Devil, and that they're trying to go with, zoom ins and stuff and doing certain things where it's trying to give that kind of authentic 70s type of production value and everything. Well, maybe not on the look, but on the actual setting and everything itself, I thought was great. If I had a nitpick on that, is that if they really wanted to go with it, because there actually was a trailer that was released where they wanted to have that kind of grindhouse look for it, I think it really would have worked if they could have had that filter over it and made it seem like that authentic type of 70s style. That way, if it was playing into the original film, it could go hand in hand with giving that look for it. But that's just more of a minor thing that I can say, it's kind of my complaint I had with, off topic with Thanksgiving last year, is that they didn't go for that type of look. So that is something I wish that some horror movies would actually go for again, because if Late Night with the Devil can get away with doing certain stuff like that, it really baffles me how certain bigger studios can't do that. Especially with this being an IP and stuff. But if I had to get into any kind of cons, we'll have to say that one of the things the movie does kind of hold back on is it does have a couple callbacks in here that I felt like were a little too remember this from the original film and stuff like that. And it does make me kind of wonder, okay, if the whole purpose of it trying to be a prequel, it really doesn't seem like it would be right to be doing certain scenes that are from the first film. Because then if you watch this film before the first movie, you kind of already know how the scene's going to play out, and it loses the kind of momentum that you want to expect to do it for, because it's like, you know, if you're doing a remake, that's one thing, but if it's being a prequel, there shouldn't be a reason why a couple scenes need to do that kind of like throwback like that. I just think that it felt too much into remake territory that wasn't needed. And then one of my other things too, I have to admit, is one of the other biggest cons I have is the movie does have some jump scares that do feel like they come, you know, predictable at times in certain scenes. Well, the really annoying thing with that is that there's parts where our lead is basically walking around and she gets basically touched by somebody just out of nowhere, and it's a random jump cut. You know, that's just the most like stereotypical type of jump scares that happens too many times in this film that I kind of got annoyed with after a while. But thankfully they didn't do it too much as the movie went on. When it stuck with more of the disturbing stuff that was happening, that was when I was more into it. That, and also it does kind of set itself kind of questionable toward the end, because it does a thing that I'm not going to spoil, but in a certain way it kind of sets itself up for something else, and I felt like that was really kind of unnecessary in my opinion, because the way that it could have ended where I thought it was going to, really could have had more of a bigger impact and just left it there. But the way it kind of ends, it does feel like there's more to it that we're probably might be getting in the future. But I really don't know how that's going to really work if this is supposed to be if this is supposed to be a direct prequel to the first film. So that's really my only kind of question like that. It's like, okay, why is this happening? But anyway, overall though, I will have to admit that this was actually quite a surprise for me. And with that, I'm going to give the movie a compelling grade on the Film Freaks meter. And so, for those of you who have also seen the first Omen and also the other films in the Omen franchise, let me know in the comments below what you thought about it. And thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in my next review. I'll see you later.